what we are doing now in the online course world is we have the Discord channel, and we have 4 weeks of meetings. We've had the first week of already. The next week is going to be early July, I think, or mid-July after the Euros. So what we do is we discuss certain topics, and then we go away and have 2 months of homework where we really learn to understand those topics by practicing and providing our own feedback, combining our feedback, having meetings and discussing what we've found. So it's not just reading a book, watching a video, it's interactive. Us as a group, we work together, get through everything, I answer questions, we discuss topics, then we actually do it in the real world. And that way I think that we can all learn to adjust our cars better, understand our cars better, and have better results on the track and more fun at the track because our cars are working how we want them to work. I will from time to time share videos on YouTube so you get an idea of what's happening, and then if you really want to be a part of it, then you can join invisiblespeed.net, always open and available. So yeah, last time we covered ride height, droop, front toe, and camber, because they are 4 very basic settings that you can make a surprisingly big change to the handling of your car if you adjust them. And I tried to think that what are the most basic things that we need for this first section, and we have to add a few more things, because when I look at people's cars, one of the things that is usually or very often off is the damping, so the shock oil that people run, and mostly it's too thick. So people seem to have a tendency to run shock oil that's too thick. Now I would recommend that for you to learn to know the feel of a car, what the suspension should feel like when you move it up and down, that you simply find someone who has a car that works well, preferably the same car as you have, and feel their suspension. And do this for, a few different cars that seem to be working well. The driver or the mechanic, they have experience, they seem to know what they're doing. Just so you get an idea of what suspension should feel like, because just about everyone who does well in racing, who have cars that work well, their suspension fits within a certain boundary of feel. There's a setup that's too light, but almost no one uses that because the car will be very bad to drive. But then there's also a point at which the oil becomes too thick. And that seems to be hard for some people to notice on the track, but you can definitely notice it on the pit table by feeling the suspension moving it up and down. And also not just slowly, but also move, for example, the front or rear end quickly up and down, and you'll see that when you do that, the suspension won't have time to move, and the tires will actually lift completely off the ground, and you start bashing them up and down. So do this. Feel the suspension of cars that are working well to learn to understand how the damping should feel just on the pit table. That's a good starting point. Why is it difficult to understand this? The reason is that we copy setup sheets online, and they don't always state the temperature at which they've been racing. So if you copy a setup sheet from some driver who's been in Arizona and it's been 35 degrees Celsius and you are at 12 degrees Celsius, it's going to be very different. The oil that you need to use is different. In hot weather, they'll be using thick oils. In colder weather, you'll be using thinner oils. So that would be my first piece of advice. And for tuning with shock oils, it's actually quite difficult. I'm actually someone that should probably adjust my shock oils more often, but I don't really. I tend to adjust other things on the car, but it's something I should sort of try to do more of, because what adjusting the shock oils does is, let's say you have a good setup, your car is good, the feel of the suspension is good, it handles the bumps well, jumps and lands well, it does everything well. What you can do with adjusting your shock oil is, if you just change your shock oil at one end of the car, you are changing the balance of the car. You're changing the time it takes for that end of the car to roll in corners or squat or dive. And that affects how the car will corner. You remember from before when we were talking about pitch and roll of the car? That's what gives the driver time to react, and the tires also time to respond to changes. So instead of the load transfer being instant, we have suspension. And as long as the suspension is moving, it's helping to delay that load transfer. So it smooths out the handling of the car. So by adjusting the shock oil at one end of the car, you are adjusting how quickly that end of the car rolls to the degree that it naturally wants to roll in that particular corner. And this can affect the car in a variety of different ways. There's not an easy rule that I can give you, do this and this will happen. It doesn't work that way. But I can give an example. So I was at a track where my car felt really good, but it had this section where you first have a long left-hand corner, then you turn right, then you turn left again. And it just felt difficult to drive there. I couldn't just turn left, right, left. I never exactly knew where the car wanted to go. It was this sort of slight uncomfortable feeling there. And the only thing I changed was I went one step thinner on my rear shock oil, but I left the front. And what happened then was that then the car was in sync with that section of the track. And I could go through that section with no problem after that. So I just changed the balance of the car a bit with my shock oils, and it improved a lot. So those are the sorts of things that you can do by adjusting shock oil. And I think that even I will have to do this homework with you guys. So when we try all these different things like ride height, droop, camber, shock oils, the idea of this is that we not only learn to understand what the right sort of range of oil is to use in each condition, but we also learn to understand what happens if we just adjust it at one end. So thicker or thinner on the front, thicker or thinner on the rear. And we see if we can notice any changes on the track. So are there any questions regarding shock oil? David. Corporate David.
Corporate David said and asked.
Yes, this also a little bit relates to the pistons. So is it good to try to adjust the pistons so that the front and rear has almost similar thickness oil? Does it give any benefit?
That's a good question. I think yes. And the reason is that our shock oils change a lot when we run. So they get thinner because they heat up and they get thinner. But you could say that let's say that the shock oils change 10% viscosity when we run. So if you are running a very big difference in your shock oil, then let's say you are running like 500 in the front then 10% is 50. It's one step. But if you are running then 250 in the rear, then 10% is just 25. It's half a step. So you've basically changed the balance of your car due to the change in viscosity in the oils. Do you see what I mean? But if you're running the same oil front and back, then front and rear will change the same amount, and the balance of the car will remain the same after you've been running your car. So I think that if you can find a setup that works with the same oil front and rear, I think it would be a benefit. Sometimes there are situations where your car is, for example, really good in qualifying, and then in long main it just goes off. I think maybe this is one of the reasons for that the balance of the car changes once it really heats up. But in 5 minutes, that's not enough time really to get to that point. And of course, sometimes it's the opposite, where the car gets really good in a long main. Okay, springs. So, changing oil and the thickness of the oil, that doesn't really affect our working range too much, right? It affects to which point within that working range the car gets in certain sections of the track, because we have a limited amount of time in each section, and you are either slowing down or speeding up the movements of the car by changing the oil. But the spring directly limits the working range. So the spring is what limits how far a car can dive or squat or roll in a corner. And the spring also affects the responsiveness of a car a lot. The softer the spring, the more it allows the suspension to deflect, the more overall grip your car will have. Harder the spring, the less it allows the car to roll. Load transfers faster, more initial grip you will have. Normally, if you look at the springs that people run, they kind of find a set of springs and then they just run those. Maybe they have two different setups. So they have one which they run 90% of the time, and then another which they run in some other condition. So maybe usually what they do is they have one setup, and then when they are on a very loose track, they go to one step softer. But springs is something that, a bit like ride height, I would say. So you set your ride height, and then you set everything around that ride height. You set your spring, you set everything around that spring. So when you change your spring, everything goes out the window, in a sense. So I think maybe that's why mostly when you check setup sheets, drivers are running the same spring. If they found a good setup, they stick with that, they build their complete setup around that spring, and the car will work everywhere. And then when you go to a very different track, then you select your backup setup, which is on a loose track, maybe one step softer than front and rear. There's another way also to work with springs, which is what Ronnefalk is doing now, for example, with the Mayako, because the way the spring is made affects how it works also. So that's another way to adjust your car with springs, to use two different types. And then finally, we have the progressive springs. So a few years ago, I made those, and they've been really well received, because what the progressive spring does, it sort of allows you to run a spring which initially is softer, so more overall grip, more stability for your car, but then it's not overly soft where it would change your car's working range too much. So then your car at the limit, your car still feels the same. It's just that initially, and as you are driving around the track in corners, you have a feeling of more grip. Then when you push it further, it's not too soft, that you still have the support from the spring. So with the progressive springs, for me, I have tended to like to run them mostly just in the rear, not on the front. The reason is when you run them on the front, it makes the precision suffer a bit. So at high speeds, going into corners, you aren't quite as confident because you lose a bit of precision. But on the rear, I really like them because if you, for example, have a situation where you have a tendency to lose rear traction in some corners, for example, mid corner, or if it's dusty or a bit bumpy, if you put those springs on, you will cure that and will lock the rear in and give you more rear grip. Neo has a question. No? Oh, you put your hand up. Okay, I saw someone wrote something in the comments. With the HB springs, I'm a step higher in the front than other drivers at my track to take out some responsiveness. Would it be better to have a thicker wire but lower similar weight? Yeah, I think definitely if you would try a different spring, so a Mayako spring or a Mugen spring, you would notice that it really calms the car down. It would reduce that responsiveness. Okay. Any questions on springs? No? What was the last thing?
How long are the Mayako springs, Joseph?
What was it? Is it 60 mil? 60 or 65?
Oh, okay,
Front.
thank you.
70 rear, I think. I can't remember. Too late in the week for that. Hey, David, didn't you just make a wiki on the springs?
Yeah, all right, check it now. I'll send it on chat.
Okay. Anti-roll bars. This is the last setup feature that you'll be allowed to touch the next 2 months. Anti-roll bars is similar to springs. They also affect directly the working range of the car. You can limit how wide the range is, but anti-roll bars only affect the car in roll, so not front to back. Springs affect front to back and to the side. Anti-roll bars only to the side. That's why I think that they are more often changed than springs, because they don't affect the car too much when it comes to jumping, landing, driving through bumps, braking, accelerating. It's more for cornering. So a very good, powerful tuning aid. And now if you go back and you remember the theory we were talking about and how tires work, and how when all tires are equally loaded, you'll have the most possible grip, and how on one axle of the car, if inside tire is very light, outside tire is very heavy, that will have less traction than an equally loaded axle where left and right tire are more equally loaded. So if left and right can be closer to the same load, it's better. You have more grip. If you lose a lot of load on the inside and you put heavy load on the outside, it will be less grip. This is very obvious with anti-roll bars. And I'll show you this video from the course, this part where I was talking about that. All of these things that we've spoken about, the ride height And changing ride height front, only rear, changes the balance of how the car feels around the track. Or if we change camber only in one end of the car, we add or remove grip from that end, we change the balance of the car. Shock oil today, how I mentioned, when I was at that one track, I was struggling in a section. I went thinner oil in my rear shocks and the problem went away. I changed the balance of my car in that section. Anti-roll bars, a great way to do this, to adjust the balance of your car. And this example illustrates how you can adjust the balance in different directions. You can add more grip to the entire car or reduce grip in the entire car. So it's an important distinction. So here, if we look at this, these dots at the outside of the tire represent how much load is on a tire. So front tires, you're turning left. The front is relatively even. The outside has a bit more than the inside, but relatively evenly loaded. On the rear, you can see rear outside is heavily loaded. Inside is very light. So actually, let's see. This situation here, it's heading towards something like this, right? But okay, turning the other direction. But here you can see that front is loaded heavily, outside rear is loaded somewhat, but inside is off the track. So this is a more extreme example of what we are looking at here, wherever it was. Here. Everyone on board still?
Mm-hmm.
We're making sense? So, how do we solve this? How did I solve it here? Let's see. There we go. Here's a solution. Two different solutions to the same problem. So what we want to do is, in that previous example, what happens is the front is more evenly loaded, so the front has grip, right, when you're turning in that corner. But the rear isn't, so the rear has a very light inside tire, heavy outside tire. The rear won't have as much grip. So you might have a problem where you lose the rear end in a corner. You have oversteer. You want to solve that. Now we have solved that problem, but in two different ways. So if we look at the red circles first, we can see that now the outside has more load on it, inside has less load on it. We can achieve this by putting a thicker anti-roll bar on the front. So what we are doing is we are trying to match the rear. The rear was very unequally loaded. We put a thicker anti-roll bar on the front, which transfers more load. Now the front is more unequally loaded also. So the car is more balanced now, but the car overall has less grip in this section. So maybe this is on a very high grip track, and we actually don't want to have that much grip. And also, because of the grip, the car is moving a lot on the track. We want to limit that. So we put a thicker anti-roll bar on. It helps to balance out the car and reduce grip and body roll a bit. So that could be a good thing. But if we did this on a loose track, now maybe in the corner we wouldn't spin out anymore, but our whole car would be loose. So we would lose time. We lost grip, we lost time, we are slower, even though our car is easier to drive. So another solution is to do the opposite. Instead of putting a thicker anti-roll bar on the front to balance out the car, we put a thinner one on the rear. So the front was more equally balanced before. We put a thinner anti-roll bar on the rear, and now the rear is more equally balanced. So that's the black lines here. So now we have a car where front and rear are more balanced, but left and right are also more equally loaded. So our car has more grip in that corner. So if we look at Elliott Boots here, he can solve this problem in 2 different ways with anti-roll bars. He could put a thicker one on the front, which will help to stop the rolling of the front, transfer more load on the front, reduce front end grip, and help to balance it out with the rear. Probably if he did that, the rear wouldn't lift the inside tire anymore, like it is here. But his whole car would have less grip. But if he instead went to a thinner rear anti-roll bar, then it would allow the rear end to roll, matching the front more. Rear wouldn't lift the inside tire off, and the whole car would have more grip. So something that I think people mistake is when they see their car doing this, like lifting a rear tire, they think, oh, I have to go to a harder anti-roll bar in the rear, like to stop that. But it actually makes it worse. If you made the rear end on this car softer, it wouldn't want to lift up this inside tire. It would allow the car to roll down more. So that's a good thing to keep in mind.
Okay.
Tutto bene. You know what time it is.
Yeah, 9
Last
o'clock.
question by Neo.
Okay, I have a strange one.
Uh-oh.
Okay, so you are a pro driver.
No.
Yeah, you won a lot of races around the Europe.
Okay.
Okay, the question is, we say that there are drivers like Ron Falk or Ongaro or someone else that are very in tune with their cars. You, as a pro driver, when you are very in tune with your car, how do you feel this? What are your feelings? There is some type of sixth sense that they have, like a professional car driver that can feel the car below his body because he is in the car. But as an RC driver, how do you feel that when you are very, very fast?
Yeah, that's once again great question.
Yeah.
So I actually did think about this recently. I can't remember why it was, but it's something that the more talented, skilled, better drivers, they can reach this point very quickly. I mean, they can't always reach it actually, but almost always, right? It's this, you can even see it happen actually. So you can watch someone like Mayfield or Ronne Falco Ongaro, you can watch them drive and they are driving well, right?
Yeah.
But then you will see this moment when they go from driving well to like extremely well, right? I don't know if you have witnessed this, but it's possible to do. And I think it's easier to do when you are on the driver's stand and you watch. And actually, I saw it also with Sanketin when he tried the Mayako after the Ridge GP. You could see it happen because he drove first, okay, and it was good. Like, the car looked good. I'm like, fuck, he's faster than me already. But then that happened, you know, and suddenly he looked that extra step faster. So the best way I can describe it is that when you are driving well and your car is good, you have a certain connection with the car, and that's sort of the normal level, but you're still reacting to what's happening as you drive around the track. But then when you reach that next level, you aren't really reacting to the car anymore. You are controlling it.
I understand.
So so that's why you can reach that next level, because you aren't sort of turning into a corner and then having to fix sliding rear end or turn out a bit because you're gonna hit the inside of the corner. Like, you aren't reacting to something going wrong. You are fully telling the car what to do all the time. So it's like instead of you being one step behind, always responding to what's happening. Oh, I hit that bump and I have to correct. Or instead of those kind of things, like, you are still driving well, but you are still reacting to what's happening. Instead of that, you are actually causing everything to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that I think that is the difference. And to do that, someone like me, I need to, most likely in Nitro, I need to hear my car. I need to be at the track and run multiple times in a row and then reach that point, where someone like David can drive for 5 minutes and then just reach that point. So that's one of the differences between the elite and good drivers, that they, whatever the situation, they are able to hone in on how their inputs are affecting the car, and then adapt their inputs to what the car requires at that point. And when they get there, then they can transfer over from reacting to what's happening to causing everything to happen.
They go forward somewhere.
Yeah, so that's how I would describe it, because there is no physical link to the car, like
Yeah.
but it almost feels like you feel the car.
Yes.
It's very strange, actually. Like, you have the confidence in the car that you know that, okay, now when I give this much throttle and I turn like this is going to happen. So in a way, in your mind, you are ahead of the car. You aren't reacting anymore. You are deciding what you want it to do. So you know that, okay, this section I'm going to do this, and you expect it to happen. And then you are thinking about that next section. And do you see what I mean? So you go from being a step behind to being a step ahead. And that's when you can really sort of really get your best laps and consistency.